Welcome to insane HOA madness. Keep your boots on for this one. I am standing in my driveway in Seattle, Washington, holding a cup of hot cocoa, when a middle-aged woman in a pink parka storms across the snow-packed street and starts yelling at me about my folding table. She is pointing at the tiny card table I set up next to my shovel, the one holding a thermos and some paper cups, and she is telling me I have violated community standards by creating an unapproved event setup. I ask her if she is serious, and she pulls out a stack of pre-filled forms from inside her coat and waves them at me like a weapon. She says the fine is $250, effective immediately, and if I do not remove the table and pay within 48 hours, the association will escalate enforcement. I look around at the quiet suburban street, the snow piling up on roof lines, the porch lights just starting to glow in the blue hour dusk, and I realize I have made a terrible mistake moving to Spruce and Snow Estates. My name is irrelevant to this story, but my job is not. I am a cable installer, which means I spend half my life dealing with easements, property lines, utility right-of-ways, and homeowners who do not understand that the box on their house belongs to the company, not to them. I moved to Seattle 6 months ago because the pay was better, the coffee was legendary, and I thought a neighborhood with a homeowners association would mean clean streets and functional snow removal. I was wrong on that last part. The Spruce and Snow Estates Association is run like a small authoritarian state where the board uses vendors as muscle and pretends it is policy, and the woman currently screaming at me about my folding table is Stephanie Kelly, the welcome committee chair who weaponizes move-in rules like a personal hobby. Everyone calls her Janet behind her back because she has that energy, but to her face you call her Miss Kelly or you get added to her list. She has been on my case since the day I moved in, starting with a notice about my mailbox flag angle and escalating to a formal complaint about my snow shovel storage. I thought the cocoa table would be harmless, a neighborly gesture while I cleared my driveway after the overnight dump, but apparently it counts as an outdoor amenity requiring prior written approval and a certificate of insurance. Janet is still talking, her breath making little clouds in the cold air, and she is explaining that the association takes winter safety seriously and any unapproved setup creates liability exposure. I point out that it is a folding table with a thermos on it, not a bonfire or a stage, and she cuts me off to say that is exactly the attitude that leads to code violations. She reaches into her coat again and pulls out a small bag of salt, the kind you buy at the hardware store, and she pours a theatrical line of it across the edge of my driveway, while telling me that proper ice mitigation is required within 6 hours of snowfall and my technique is insufficient. I stare at the salt line, then at her, and I realize she is performing for someone. I glance over my shoulder and see a maintenance worker in a reflective vest standing near the community snowplow at the end of the block, watching us silently. He is holding a clipboard and he does not look surprised. This is not the first time Janet has done this. I asked Janet if the association is going to fine me for the table or for the salt technique, and she says both, plus a third violation for failing to break up the ice chunks left by the HOA plow along my curb. She points at the jagged ridge of frozen slush and plow debris along the street edge, the stuff the community plow pushed into everyone's driveways when it came through this morning, and she tells me it is my responsibility to clear it immediately because it creates a pedestrian hazard. I ask her what immediately means, and she says within 2 hours of the plow pass, which was at 7 in the morning, which means I am already 5 hours late. I was at work at 7 in the morning, running cable through a crawl space in Ballard, but Janet does not care. She taps her stack of forms and says ignorance of the schedule is not an excuse, and if I do not have the ice cleared by sunset, she will authorize a vendor to do it and bill me at premium rates. I look at the sun, which is already touching the horizon, and I look at the ice chunks, which would take an hour with a pick and a shovel, and I feel my jaw tighten. Janet leans in close, her face lit orange by the porch light behind me, and she says, "You think this is petty. I think this is my purpose." She says it like a mantra, like she has been waiting to deliver that line, and she smiles when she sees my expression. Then she adds, "The board will back me because they are afraid of me." She taps the forms again, turns on her heel, and walks back across the street toward her own house, which has a perfect driveway, a perfect walkway, and a decorative wreath on the door that probably required a variance approval. I stand there holding my cocoa, which is now cold, and I look at the folding table and the ice chunks and the maintenance worker who is still watching. I wave at him. He does not wave back. He just writes something on his clipboard and climbs into the plow truck. I realize I am in trouble, the kind of trouble that does not go away with an apology or a quick fix, and I also realize I am going to need evidence. I pull out my phone and I start taking pictures. I photograph the table, the thermos, the salt line Janet poured, the ice chunks along the curb, and the plow truck driving away. I also open my doorbell camera app and I scroll back to this morning when the plow came through. The footage shows the plow pushing a wall of slush and ice directly into my driveway entrance at 7:14 in the morning, and it shows me leaving for work 6 minutes later, stepping over the mess because I did not have time to deal with it. I download the clip and I save it to 3 places. Then I fold up the table, pour out the cocoa, and I start chipping away at the ice chunks with my shovel, even though the sun is already gone and the porch lights are the only thing keeping me from working in total darkness. I have a medical appointment tomorrow morning, a follow-up for a shoulder injury from a fall on a job site last year, and rescheduling would take months because the specialist is booked solid. I cannot afford to miss it, and I cannot afford to give Janet any more ammunition. I work until my hands are numb and my breath is coming hard, and by the time I finish, it is full dark and my driveway looks worse than it did before because I have turned the ice chunks into a slush soup that is already starting to refreeze. I go inside and I take a hot shower and I sit down at my kitchen table with my laptop and a notepad. I am not a lawyer, but I have spent enough time dealing with easement disputes and utility agreements to know how to read a contract, and I have a copy of the Spruce and Snow Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions sitting in my filing cabinet. I pull it out and I start reading. The cocoa table violation is listed under Section 12, Temporary Structures and Events, which defines an event as any gathering of 3 or more persons, or any setup intended to accommodate guests. My table had 0 persons, and was intended to accommodate me. The salt violation is listed under Section 9, Winter Maintenance Standards, which requires property owners to mitigate ice hazards using approved methods within a reasonable time frame. Reasonable is not defined, and approved methods are not listed. The ice chunk violation is listed under Section 9.3, which assigns responsibility for plow debris removal to the property owner, but it does not specify a time frame and it does not authorize vendor billing without a hearing. I start taking notes, and I realize Janet has overstepped on at least 2 of the 3 violations, but I also realize the association does not care about overstepping because they have a management company that rubber stamps everything Janet submits. I get an email at 9:30 that night. It is from the Spruce and Snow Estates Management Company, a firm called Peak Compliance Group, and it confirms 3 violations with a total fine of $750 due within 14 days. It also includes a notice that my amenities access has been suspended pending payment, which means I cannot use the mailbox cluster key, the community gate code, or the guest parking permits until I settle the account. I read it twice, then I read it again, and I feel my stomach drop. The mailbox cluster is the only place to receive mail in this neighborhood because the Postal Service does not deliver to individual houses. The gate code is required to enter the back parking area where I keep my work van because street parking is prohibited overnight. The guest parking permits are irrelevant because I do not have guests, but the other 2 are going to cripple my daily routine. I have a medical appointment in 8 hours and I need to leave by 6:30 to make it on time, which means I need to move my van out of the back lot tonight before my gate code gets deactivated, assuming it has not been deactivated already. I grab my keys and my coat and I walk out to the back gate in the freezing dark. I punch in my code and the keypad flashes red. Access denied. I try again. Same result. I pull out my phone and I call the management company emergency line, which goes to voicemail. I leave a message explaining that I need access to my vehicle for a medical appointment and I need the gate opened immediately, and then I stand there in the cold staring at the keypad like it is going to change its mind. It does not. I walk back to my house and I start looking up the cost of an Uber to the medical center, which is 40 minutes away in good traffic, and I realize I am going to spend $60 round trip because Janet decided my cocoa table was a threat to the community. I sit down on my couch and I stare at the email from Peak Compliance Group, and I notice something. The email is signed by a compliance officer named Derek Hale, but the violation descriptions are written in first person, and they use phrases like "I observed" and "I determined," which means Janet wrote them herself and the management company just forwarded them. I screenshot the email and I add it to my evidence folder. The next morning, I take an Uber to my appointment and I spend the entire ride drafting an email to the HOA board. I explain that the violations are inaccurate, that the amenities lockout is retaliatory, and that I am requesting an immediate hearing to dispute the fines. I attach the doorbell footage of the plow creating the ice chunk mess. I attach the timeline showing I was at work when the plow came through, and I attach a photograph of the folding table with a tape measure showing it is 2 feet by 3 feet, which is smaller than a mailbox and clearly not an event set, up. I hit send as the Uber pulls into the medical center parking lot, and I walk into my appointment feeling like I have accomplished something. The appointment takes 90 minutes, which is longer than expected because the specialist wants to do a follow-up x-ray, and when I finally get back outside and check my phone, I have 3 missed calls from a number I do not recognize and a text message from my neighbor 2 doors down. The text says, "Tow truck at your house." I call the neighbor and he tells me a flatbed tow truck is parked in front of my driveway and the driver is taking pictures of my van, which is still trapped behind the locked gate in the back lot. I ask him if the driver has hooked up the van yet, and he says no, he is just circling it like a shark. I thank him and I hang up and I call another Uber. The ride back takes 40 minutes because of midday traffic, and by the time I get home, the tow truck is gone, but there is a bright orange sticker on my front door. The sticker says my vehicle has been marked for removal due to unauthorized parking in a restricted zone, and I have 24 hours to move it, or it will be towed at my expense. I read the sticker 3 times, and then I walk around to the back gate and I look through the chain link at my van, which is parked in the spot I pay $50 a month to rent from the HOA, the spot that is listed on my lease agreement and my parking permit. The van has an orange sticker on the windshield that matches the one on my door. I take a picture of both stickers, I take a picture of my parking permit hanging from the rearview mirror, and I take a picture of the gate keypad still flashing red when I try my code. Then I call the towing company whose number is printed on the sticker. A woman answers and I explain the situation, and she tells me the tow was authorized by the property management company and the vehicle is parked in violation of overnight guest restrictions. I tell her it is not a guest vehicle, it is my work van, and I have a paid parking spot. She puts me on hold for 2 minutes. Then she comes back and says the authorization came from the compliance officer and she cannot override it without written proof of residency and a valid parking permit. I tell her I have both and I can email them right now, and she gives me an address. I send the documents while I am still on the phone, and she confirms receipt and says she will flag the vehicle as disputed, but the sticker stays until the management company withdraws the tow order. I call Peak Compliance Group next, and I get Derek Hale, the compliance officer. I explain that my van is legally parked, that my gate code has been deactivated without notice, and that I have a tow sticker on a vehicle that is not in violation of anything. Derek listens. Then he says the gate code was deactivated due to the amenities suspension in my violation notice, and the tow order was submitted by the Welcome Committee chair based on a report that the vehicle was unregistered with the association. I ask him what unregistered means, and he says all vehicles parked overnight in the back lot must be registered with the office and display a current year sticker. I tell him my van has a parking permit issued by the HOA, and he says the permit is not the same as the registration sticker. I ask him where I get a registration sticker, and he says I should have received one in my welcome packet when I moved in. I did not receive a welcome packet. I received a stack of violation notices from Janet, and I tell him that. He sighs and says he will look into it, but in the meantime, I need to remove the vehicle from the lot within 24 hours or the tow will proceed. I ask him how I am supposed to remove the vehicle when my gate code does not work, and he says I can request a temporary access code by submitting a form to the office. I ask him how long the form takes to process, and he says 3 to 5 business days. I tell him that does not solve my 24-hour problem, and he says I can pay the outstanding fines and my access will be restored immediately. I hang up. I am standing in my kitchen staring at my phone when I get a text from a board member I have never met. The message says, "Call me. This is insane." I call the number and a man named Greg answers. He tells me he is on the HOA board, he lives 4 streets over, and he is fed up with the way Janet runs the welcome committee like a personal fiefdom. He says he saw my email to the board and he wants to help, but he needs me to understand that Janet has leverage because she has been on the board for 8 years, and she has a file cabinet full of complaints and violations she uses to keep everyone in line. He says the board is afraid of her because she threatens to expose every minor infraction anyone has ever committed if they vote against her proposals. He also says the management company is in her pocket because she feeds them a steady stream of violation fees, which the management company takes a percentage of, which means they have no incentive to push back on her. I ask him why he is telling me this, and he says because Janet just submitted a proposal to authorize a second tow attempt on my van after I put them on notice to stop, and he wants me to know it is coming so I can prepare. Greg tells me the board is meeting tonight at 7, and Janet is going to argue that my vehicle is a safety hazard because it is a commercial van in a residential lot, which is prohibited under Section 14 of the covenants. I tell him my van is not prohibited. It is a standard cargo van with company logos, and half the neighborhood has work trucks parked in the back lot. He says he knows, but Janet is going to claim the logos make it a commercial advertisement, which requires a waiver. He also says she is going to bring up the cocoa table and the ice chunks and frame the whole thing as a pattern of disregard for community standards. He tells me I need to attend the meeting and I need to bring evidence. And he also tells me not to let Janet bait me into losing my temper because that is her specialty. He says, I have seen her do this to 5 people in the last 2 years, and 4 of them moved out. I thank him, and I ask him if he can leak me any other information, and he laughs and says he already is by calling me. Then he hangs up. I spend the rest of the afternoon organizing my evidence. I print out the doorbell footage stills, the parking permit, the lease agreement, the email from Peak Compliance Group, the tow stickers, and the section of the covenants that defines temporary structures. I also print out the timeline showing when the plow came through and when I left for work, and I print out a photograph of the salt line Janet poured across my driveway because it is the most absurd thing I have ever seen, and I want it on the record. Then I sit down and I write out a statement. 3 paragraphs summarizing the facts and requesting that the fines be rescinded and the amenities suspension be lifted. I practice reading it out loud twice, and then I get dressed and I walk over to the community center where the board meets. The meeting room is a narrow space with folding chairs arranged in rows and a folding table at the front where the board sits. There are maybe 15 people in the audience, most of them older homeowners who look like they have been coming to these meetings for years, and there is Janet sitting in the front row with her stack of pre-filled forms and a tablet held away from the camera mounted on the wall. She looks at me when I walk in, and she smiles. I sit in the back row and I wait. The board president, a retired accountant named Bill, calls the meeting to order and runs through the agenda. Old business, new business, committee reports, and then violations and enforcement. Janet is listed under violations and enforcement. I watch the clock. It takes 30 minutes to get through the other items. And then Bill says, "Welcome committee report, Stephanie Kelly." Janet stands up and she walks to the front of the room with her tablet, and she starts talking. She says the Welcome Committee has identified a pattern of non-compliance at a property on Cascade Lane, and she believes the association needs to take stronger action to protect the community. She pulls up a photo on her tablet, it is my house, and she points out the folding table in the driveway, which she describes as an unsanctioned gathering space. She pulls up another photo, it is my van, and she says the vehicle displays commercial signage in violation of Section 14 and poses a safety risk because it blocks sight lines in the parking lot. She does not mention that the lot is designed for vehicles that size or that there are 3 other work trucks parked in the same row. She pulls up a third photo, it is the ice chunks along my curb, and she says I failed to mitigate a pedestrian hazard within the required time frame. Then she looks directly at me and she says, "This homeowner has shown repeated disregard for our rules, and I am requesting the board authorize immediate towing of the vehicle and escalation of fines to the maximum allowable under the covenants." Bill looks uncomfortable, and Greg, the board member who called me, leans forward and says, "Can we hear from the homeowner first?" Janet turns to look at him, and for a second I think she is going to argue, but then she shrugs and sits down. I stand up and I walk to the front with my folder. I introduce myself, I state my address, and I say I am here to dispute 3 violations issued by the Welcome Committee. I pull out the photo of the folding table and I hold it up. I say this is a 2-foot by 3-foot card table that held a thermos while I shoveled my driveway. It was not an event, it was not a gathering, and it did not require approval. I pull out the doorbell footage stills and I hold them up. I say this is footage from my doorbell camera showing the HOA plow pushing ice and slush into my driveway at 7:14 in the morning. I was at work at 7:20. I could not clear the debris within 2 hours because I was not home. I pull out my parking permit and my lease agreement and I hold them up. I say, this is my paid parking permit and my signed lease showing I am authorized to park my work van in the back lot. The van is not a commercial advertisement. It is a standard cargo van with a company logo, the same as half the vehicles in that lot. I put the documents on the table in front of Bill and I look at Janet. I say, the Welcome Committee chair told me this morning that the board will back her because they are afraid of her. I did not believe it until I sat here and watched her present 3 false violations without a single fact check. I look at Bill and I say, I am requesting that these fines be rescinded, that my amenities access be restored immediately, and that the tow order on my vehicle be withdrawn. Janet stands up and she says, this is exactly the attitude I was describing. She looks at the board and she says, he is disrupting the process and deflecting accountability. Bill raises his hand and says, let him finish. I take a breath and I say, I have one more thing. I pull out the photo of the salt line Janet poured across my driveway and I hold it up. I say this is a theatrical salt pour performed by the Welcome Committee chair while a maintenance worker watched. It was staged, it was absurd, and it was done to create a record that does not reflect reality. I put the photo on the table and I sit down. The room is silent for a long moment. Then Greg leans forward and he says, I move to rescind all 3 violations and restore full amenities access. Another board member, a woman named Carol, says, I second. Bill looks at Janet, and Janet is staring at me with her mouth half open, and then she recovers and she says, you cannot just rescind violations without an investigation. Greg says, we just heard the investigation. Janet snaps, you are setting a precedent that anyone can dispute a violation by showing up and lying. Greg says, he is not lying, he has documentation. Janet grabs her tablet and she starts swiping through photos, and she says, I have documentation too. I have timestamps and witness statements. Bill interrupts and says, what witness statements? Janet hesitates, and then she says, the maintenance worker observed the violations. Bill says, did you get a written statement? Janet says, it is implied in the plow schedule. Greg laughs, actually laughs out loud, and he says, implied is not a witness. Bill calls for a vote, and the motion passes 4-1, with Janet voting against. Bill tells me the fines are rescinded, the amenities suspension is lifted, and the tow order is withdrawn. He also tells me I will receive a formal letter within 48 hours confirming the reversal. I thank him, I gather my documents, and I walk out of the room before Janet can corner me. I walk home in the dark, and I feel lighter than I have in days, But I also know this is not over. Janet does not lose gracefully, and she has 8 years of board tenure and a file cabinet full of leverage. I get home and I check my email, and there is already a new message from Peak Compliance Group. It is not about the violations. It is about a monthly audit fee of $75 that was supposedly added to my account 6 months ago and is now overdue with late penalties. I read the email twice, and I realize it is a different tactic. Janet cannot find me for the table or the ice or the van, so she is going to bury me in administrative fees that are harder to dispute. I forward the email to Greg and I ask him if this is normal. He replies in under a minute. He says, no, this is retaliation. He also says, check the management company contract, because I think they are padding invoices. I pull up the HOA management contract, which is hosted on the association website in a password-protected section that I can now access again because my amenities lockout was lifted. The contract is 60 pages long and written in dense legal language, but I skim through it until I find the fee schedule. Monthly audit fees are listed as optional services, which means they require board approval before they can be charged to individual homeowners. I search my email for any notice of board approval, and I find nothing. I search the association meeting minutes, which are also on the website, and I find a line item from 4 months ago that says, audit fee proposal, tabled pending legal review. Tabled means it was never approved. I screenshot the contract section in the meeting minutes, and I add them to my evidence folder. Then I reply to the Peak Compliance Group email, and I explain that the audit fee was never authorized by the board, and I am disputing the charge. I get an auto reply saying my message has been received and will be reviewed within 5 business days. The next morning I wake up to a text from my neighbor 2 doors down. The text says, snowblower at your house, and it includes a photo of a man in coveralls standing in my driveway holding a stopwatch and staring at a running snowblower. I get dressed and I go outside, and sure enough, there is a contractor in my driveway with a commercial snowblower, and he is timing how long it takes to clear a 2-foot wide path from my front door to the street. I walk up to him and I ask him what he is doing, and he says he was hired by the HOA to evaluate snow removal response times for properties that have been flagged for non-compliance. I ask him who flagged my property, and he pulls out a work order and shows me Janet's signature. I take a picture of the work order, and then I ask him how much the HOA is paying him. He says $250 for the site visit and evaluation. I ask him if he is going to bill me, and he says no, the HOA is covering it, but the evaluation report will be submitted to the compliance officer and could result in future fines if my response time is deemed inadequate. I thank him and I go back inside and I call Greg. Greg answers on the second ring and he says I heard. Apparently, Janet authorized the snowblower evaluation as part of a new winter safety initiative, which she pushed through in an emergency email vote while the rest of the board was dealing with a busted pipe at the community center. He says the vote was technically valid because the bylaws allow emergency measures, but the initiative itself is a sham because it only targets properties Janet has a grudge against. He tells me there are 3 other homeowners being evaluated today, and all 3 of them have disputed violations in the past 6 months. He also tells me he is drafting a formal complaint to the board about Janet's abuse of the emergency vote process, but it will take time to build support because the other board members are scared of her. I ask him what I should do in the meantime, and he says, document everything and do not give her an inch. I go to work and I try to focus, but my phone keeps buzzing with updates. The contractor finishes his evaluation and submits a report that says my snow removal response time is adequate, which means Janet wasted $250 of HOA funds to prove nothing. Greg texts me a copy of the report and he says, she is spiraling. That afternoon, I get another email from Peak Compliance Group, this time informing me that the association is conducting a community-wide compliance review and my property has been selected for an exterior inspection. The inspection is scheduled for tomorrow at 9 in the morning, and it will cover landscaping, exterior maintenance, and seasonal storage. I reply and ask what seasonal storage means, and the compliance officer replies with a link to Section 18 of the covenants, which prohibits visible storage of seasonal equipment including, but not limited to snow shovels, ice melt containers, and tire chains. I look out my window at my front porch, where my snow shovel is leaning against the railing next to a bucket of ice melt, exactly where every other house on the block keeps their winter gear. I take a picture of my porch, then I walk down the street and I take pictures of 6 other porches, all of which have shovels and buckets. I send the photos to Greg with a message that says, "Is she serious?" He replies, "Yes." The next morning, I am standing on my porch at 8:55 when a woman in a peak compliance group jacket shows up with a clipboard. She introduces herself as Rachel, and she tells me she is here to conduct the exterior inspection. I ask her if this is standard or targeted, and she looks uncomfortable and says she is just following the work order. I let her do her inspection, and she takes notes on her clipboard while walking around my property. She photographs my shovel and my ice melt bucket, she photographs a recycling bin that is sitting on the side of my house, and she photographs a small patch of bare dirt in my front yard where the snow has melted and exposed some dead grass. She tells me the shovel and bucket are in violation of Section 18, the recycling bin is in violation of Section 11 for visible storage outside of designated trash days, and the dead grass is a landscaping maintenance issue under Section 7. I ask her if she is inspecting the other houses on the block, and she says she is only assigned to my property. I thank her for her honesty and I take a photo of her inspection badge. She leaves, and 20 minutes later I get an email with 3 new violations and a total fine of $600. I call Greg and I tell him what happened, and he says, "This is it. We have to stop her." He tells me he has been collecting emails from other board members and homeowners, and he has found evidence that Janet has been using the management company to pad invoices and add unauthorized fees to homeowner accounts. He says the management company gets a percentage of every fine and fee they collect, which means they have a financial incentive to rubber stamp whatever Janet submits. He also says one of the other board members, Carol, has been digging into the association's financial records, and she found a series of legal fees that were added to the budget without board approval. The fees total over $15,000, and they are all tied to vendor contracts that Janet authorized without competitive bids. Greg says if we can prove she is misusing association funds, we can force a vote to remove her from the committee. I ask him what he needs from me, and he says, "Keep fighting your violations and keep documenting. You are the test case." That night I sit down and I draft a formal dispute letter for the 3 new violations. I attach the photos of the other porches showing that everyone has visible seasonal storage. I attach the section of the covenants that defines visible storage and point out that it does not prohibit snow shovels during winter. And I attach the inspection timeline showing that Rachel only inspected my probe, already despite the email claiming it was a community-wide review. I also include a paragraph requesting a full accounting of the fees and fines assessed to my account, and I cite the contract provision that allows homeowners to audit their own records. I send the letter to the board, to Peak Compliance Group, and to Janet directly. Then I wait. 2 days later, I get a reply from Janet. The email is short, and it says, "Your disputes are noted and will be reviewed at the next board meeting. In the meantime, all fines remain in effect, and failure to pay will result in additional late fees and potential lien action." I forward the email to Greg, and he replies, "She is stalling." The next board meeting is 3 weeks away, which means Janet is trying to run out the clock and stack late fees on top of the original fines. Greg tells me he and Carol are working on a motion to hold an emergency meeting to address the financial irregularities, but they need a 3rd board member to support it, and the other 2 are waffling. He says, "I need you to show up at the mailbox cluster tomorrow morning at 9. There is something you need to see." I show up at the mailbox cluster the next morning, and there are already a dozen people there, all of them shoveling the walkway and clearing snow from around the mailboxes. Greg is there, and so is Carol, and so is the maintenance worker in the reflective vest who watched Janet pour the salt line in my driveway. Greg pulls me aside and he says, "Watch Janet." She shows up 5 minutes later in her pink parka and gray earmuffs, and she walks up to the mailbox cluster with her tablet and her stack of pre-filled forms. She starts taking photos of people's shoveling techniques, and she starts writing notes on her forms, and then she walks up to a woman in her 70s and tells her that her ice mitigation is insufficient and she needs to add more salt. The woman looks confused, and Janet pulls out her theatrical salt bag and pours a line across the walkway in front of the woman's mailbox. The woman says, "I just salted that 10 minutes ago," and Janet says, "It is not about when you salted, it is about whether the coverage is adequate." Then Janet turns and sees me, and her expression changes. She walks over and she says, "You are not supposed to be here. Your amenities access was suspended." I pull out my phone and I show her the email from Bill confirming that my suspension was lifted. She stares at the email, and then she says, "That decision was appealed." I say, "By who?" She says, "By me, and the appeal is under review." I look at Greg and he shakes his head. There is no appeal process in the bylaws. Janet realizes she has been caught in a lie, and she pivots. She says, "Fine, you can access the mailboxes, but you cannot interfere with committee business." Then she turns back to the woman in her 70s, and she starts writing another violation notice. The woman looks upset, and Carol steps forward and says, "Stephanie, this is harassment." Janet spins around, and she says, "You think this is petty. I think this is my purpose." The second time she says it, it sounds angrier, more desperate. Carol says, "I am calling for a vote to suspend your committee authority pending a financial review." Janet laughs and she says, "You do not have the votes." Carol pulls out her phone and she shows Janet a text thread with 2 other board members who have agreed to support the motion. Janet's face goes pale and she says, "The board will back me because they are afraid of me." Carol says, "Not anymore." Janet looks around at the dozen people standing at the mailbox cluster, all of them watching her, and she realizes she has lost her audience. She grabs her tablet and her forms and she walks away, and the woman in her 70s starts crying. I spend the next week waiting for the emergency board meeting, and in the meantime I keep getting emails from Peak Compliance Group. The first email is a reminder that my fines are overdue. The second email is a late fee notice adding another $150 to my account. The third email is a notice that the association is preparing to file a lien against my property if I do not pay within 7 days. I forward all 3 emails to Greg, and he tells me to ignore them because the board is about to pull the plug on the whole operation. He also tells me that Carol found the smoking gun. The management company has been adding legal fees to homeowner accounts without itemizing the services, and when Carol requested an invoice breakdown, the management company sent her a document showing that most of the fees were for consultation calls with Janet that had nothing to do with actual legal work. The fees were being split between the management company and a law firm that Janet's husband works for. It is a kickback scheme, and it is a violation of the management contract. The emergency board meeting happens on a Tuesday night, and the room is packed. There are at least 30 homeowners in the audience, most of them people who have been fined or harassed by Janet in the past year. Janet is sitting in the front row with her tablet and her forms, and she looks calm, but I can see her hands shaking. Bill calls the meeting to order and he says, "We are here to address concerns about financial irregularities in the association's management contract and the enforcement practices of the Welcome Committee." Carol stands up and she presents the invoice breakdown showing the unauthorized legal fees. She explains that the fees total over $15,000, that they were never approved by the board, and that they appear to be a conflict of interest involving the compliance officer and the Welcome Committee chair. Janet stands up and she says, "This is a witch hunt." Carol says, "This is an audit." Bill calls for a vote to suspend Janet's committee authority and to terminate the contract with Peak Compliance Group pending a full financial review. The vote passes unanimously, with Janet abstaining. Bill tells Janet she is suspended effective immediately, and she is required to turn over all committee records and files within 48 hours. Janet grabs her tablet and she walks out of the room without saying a word. The next day I get an email from a new management company, a local firm called Clearview HOA Services, and the email says they have been hired to take over association management, and they are conducting a review of all outstanding violations and fines. They ask me to submit any documentation I have related to my disputes, and they promise a response within 10 business days. I send them everything: the photos, the doorbell footage, the emails, the violation notices, the work orders, the inspection reports, the contract excerpts, the meeting minutes, and the timeline. I also include a cover letter explaining that I believe the fines were issued in retaliation for disputing the original violations, and I request a full refund and a formal apology. The new management company replies the next day. The email says, "We have reviewed your file, and we agree that the violations were improperly issued. All fines have been removed from your account and your record has been cleared. We apologize for the inconvenience." I read the email 3 times, and then I forward it to Greg with a message that says, "Is this real?" He replies, "Yes. Welcome to the other side." 2 weeks later, I get a notice that the association is filing a small claims lawsuit against Janet and Pete Compliance Group to recover the $15,000 in unauthorized fees and to seek damages for the fraudulent billing scheme. The notice also says that any homeowner who was fined or charged fees by Pete Compliance Group in the past year is eligible to join the lawsuit as a class. I sign up along with 8 other homeowners, and we all submit our documentation to the association's attorney. The lawsuit moves fast because the evidence is overwhelming, and within 3 months we have a settlement hearing at the King County Courthouse. I show up wearing my work clothes because I have a job site afterward, and I sit in the back of the courtroom while the attorney presents the case. Janet is there with her own lawyer, and she looks small and tired and nothing like the person who terrorized me over a folding table. The attorney presents the invoice trail showing the bogus legal fees, the kickback arrangement, the unauthorized vendor contracts, and the pattern of retaliatory enforcement. He also presents the doorbell footage of Janet placing a violation notice on my door, and he plays the audio where she claims she never came by. The footage is time-stamped and geotagged, and it shows Janet walking up to my door, sticking the notice under my windshield wiper, and walking away. The attorney pauses the video and he says, "The defendant stated in a sworn deposition that she never personally delivered notices to this property. This footage proves otherwise." Janet's lawyer argues that the footage is taken out of context, but the judge is not buying it. The judge reviews the evidence, and then he orders Janet and Pete Compliance Group to pay the association $32,000 in restitution, legal fees, and damages. He also orders Janet to issue a formal written apology to every homeowner who was fined or harassed, and he orders her to appear at the next board meeting to read the apology on the record in front of the room. Janet's lawyer tries to object, but the judge cuts him off and says, "Your client abused her authority and cost this community tens of thousands of dollars. She will apologize, or I will hold her in contempt." If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA takedowns and neighborhood justice. The apology happens 3 weeks later at a regular board meeting. The room is packed again, and everyone is there to watch. Janet walks to the front of the room with a single sheet of paper, and she reads the apology in a flat monotone. She says, "I apologize for overstepping my authority as Welcome Committee Chair. I apologize for issuing violations without proper review. I apologize for authorizing fees without board approval. I apologize for the harm I caused to the community." When she finishes, she folds the paper and she walks out of the room without looking at anyone. The board president thanks her for her statement, and then he announces that the Welcome Committee is being restructured with new oversight rules and term limits. He also announces that the association has hired a third-party compliance consultant to audit all past violations and ensure they were issued properly, and any homeowner who believes they were wrongly fined can request a review. I submit a request that night, and 2 weeks later I get a letter saying my file has been cleared and I am eligible for a refund of all fines paid in the past year. I did not pay any fines, but the letter also includes a credit of $500 toward future HOA fees as compensation for the harassment. I take it. The city gets involved a month later when someone files a complaint about the HOA interfering with municipal snow removal routes. Apparently, Janet had been calling the city plow drivers and demanding they skip certain streets or change their schedules based on her personal complaints, and the drivers had been ignoring her, but the calls were logged and someone at Public Works finally noticed the pattern. The city sends a formal warning letter to the HOA board stating that interference with snow removal operations is a violation of municipal code and could result in fines of up to $10,000 per incident. The board responds by issuing a new policy explicitly prohibiting any HOA officer or committee chair from contacting city vendors or employees without board approval, and they send a copy of the policy to every homeowner. Janet's name is not mentioned in the policy, but everyone knows who it is about. Greg texts me a week later and says, "She resigned." Janet submitted a resignation letter to the board citing personal reasons, and the board accepted it effective immediately. Greg also tells me that the insurance carrier for the association threatened to cancel the policy because the harassment complaints were stacking up, and the carrier considered the HOA a liability risk. The board had to agree to implement new training for all committee chairs and to hire an independent mediator to handle disputes before they escalate to violations. Greg says it is not perfect, but it is better. I agree. I run into Janet one more time 3 months later at the grocery store in Ballard. She is in the checkout line ahead of me, and she does not see me at first. Then she turns around to grab a bag, and we make eye contact. She freezes, and for a second I think she is going to say something, but then she just nods and turns back to her groceries. I nod back. I do not need anything from her. The apology was for the record, not for me. I already won. The neighborhood is quieter now. The new management company does not send violation notices for folding tables or salt lines or shovels on porches. The board meetings are shorter and less hostile. People shovel their driveways without timing themselves, and the maintenance worker in the reflective vest waves when I see him at the mailbox cluster. I still have my work van parked in the back lot, and I still have my cocoa table in the garage, and sometimes on snowy mornings I set it up in the driveway, and I make myself a cup, and I shovel in peace. I got a final letter from the association attorney last month. It included a check for $800, my share of the settlement after legal fees, and a note thanking me for being part of the class action. I deposited the check and I used it to pay for the new camera I installed on my back porch, the one that covers the gate and the parking lot. I also used some of it to buy a second thermos and a box of good coffee, and I keep them on the folding table in my garage, just in case. Greg stopped by last week to drop off a copy of the new HOA bylaws. The Welcome Committee no longer has unilateral enforcement authority. All violations require board review before fines are issued, and there is a formal appeals process with a neutral third-party mediator. Greg says it is not perfect, but it is functional, and that is more than they had before. He also tells me that 2 other homeowners who were targeted by Janet have since been cleared and refunded, and one of them is running for the board in the next election. I tell him I might run too, just to make sure no one ever pulls that nonsense again. He laughs and says, "You would win." I do not know what happened to Janet after she resigned. I heard she moved to a condo in Bellevue, somewhere without an HOA, and I hope she is happier there. I do not wish her harm, but I also do not miss her. The Spruce and Snow Estates Association is not perfect, but it is livable now, and that is all I ever wanted. I can park my van, I can shovel my driveway, I can set up my folding table, and I can drink my cocoa in peace. That is enough. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.